Hello everyone and welcome to Warrior Gaming. Today we're going to be going over Newbro Flight School. Learn how to pew pew while surviving. Check it out after this. Welcome back everybody to Warrior Gaming. Again, we're going to be going over Newbro Flight School here relating to Eve Echoes. We're going to teach you what it means to be in a fleet, PvP, what lessons you should be learning, and how you should be acting within certain situations of combat or fleet activities. So for those of you who have played Eve Online, it can be an in-depth game with a very steep learning curve. And for those of you who are just now learning the game of Eve Echoes and have no prior Eve Online experience, the game can be difficult to learn, let alone master the mechanics. And of course, I'm in no way, shape, or form an expert at the game of Eve. The info provided will improve or evolve only through your feedback and questions, so do keep that in mind. And also, for those of you who are from Eve Online, Eve Echoes is no different from Eve Online, but it does have some slight differences in terms of some gameplay mechanics, modules, distances, damage tables, etc. So let's start getting into it. Every FC will run their fleet differently from one FC to the next. A lot of information presented here today can be utilized for most fleets in general, but your FC's calls and information provided by them takes precedence. If you don't understand something in a fleet, just ask in your Corp Alliance or fleet chat for someone to explain it to you in detail. You don't know unless you ask. And when I state FC, FC as well as JFC mean Fleet Commander and Junior Fleet Commander respectively, and the FC is almost always pretty much the equivalent of a party leader. They are the leader of the fleet, and the JFC would be the second in command, just in case the FC is eliminated off the field. So what's the goal of this training today? Well, the main thing is to provide the essentials for understanding how a PvP fleet operates, make it to where you become comfortable within the fleet and its members, learn how to survive while within a fleet and combat, along with understanding the different roles within a fleet and how they function on a basic level. Now remember, this will be mostly teaching you just the bare minimum, the basics, general understanding of how fleets operate, their roles, situational awareness, etc. So if you have any questions, drop them in the comments below and I'll make sure to answer them as soon as I can for you guys. So how do I find the fleet in Eve Echoes? Well, there's different types of fleets. The main thing, if you're looking for a fleet, is click your character portrait in the top left, and then in the bottom left under social, you'll see the fleet icon. From there, you can then click on the following screen for find, and you'll be able to look for either friendly fleets or just open public fleets of random neutral players, or potentially red players if you're in a corp or alliance that has standings or diplomacy that's already been set for warfare purposes. So for 6th Empire and for various other corporations or alliances, there are what they call public calendars or public event calendars. For those of you who are from EVE Online, you'll remember Spectre Fleet and their public calendars of events and fittings. You could find them either through their website, through the in-game fleet tool, or maybe in your corp or alliance. There's planned fleets, which are through Discord announcements or public alliance calendars or corp calendars. There's also in-the-moment fleets, such as somebody came into your system that you're mining and attacked one of your friends or yourself, and you're forming up to try to kill him or get him out of the system. There's also standing fleets, which are primarily for nullsec, but they can also be used in lowsec in terms of having a fleet that roams around or runs defensive operations for security for your friendlies in system or in the surrounding systems in case hostiles decide they try to, gang up on them or try to gank them. And then of course Fleet Finder, which we just went over, and if all else fails, just form one yourself. Once you form one yourself, you can actually set it up to where bounty distribution, if you're ratting, is either equal shares or goes to the highest damage. and you can make it open to your corporation as well as any individual player or players with a minimum standing of either just any player, whether they're hostile, friendly, or neutral. Neutral status, which means that they don't have a diplomatic standing for yourself or your corporate alliance, or just friendlies, which means anyone that's placed in friendly status either on your character or through the corporate alliance. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, but I just started, so I must be useless. No such thing. Many day 1 players are just as capable as day 30 old players, in the sense that if you just started and you only have a frigate, you're not entirely useless. You can go what's called a tackler, which has modules that keep targets on grid, which is the area of view, where they can't run away, and either you or your friends can beat them up and destroy their ship. There's also E-War, which just recently came out as of today with the update for Eve Echoes, meaning you could use electronic warfare such as webifying, sensor dampeners, target disruptors, guidance disruptors, or target painters in order to give debuffs or buffs on the field for your friendlies or for the hostiles. Every ship on grid matters and has an impact. That little bit of damage you putting out in a frigate could be the determining factor of either killing the enemy or not. And you know that from a lot of other MMORPGs, that little bit of extra boost in damage makes all the world of difference. So, just like Albion Online, for example. That one higher tier poison could make the difference of dismounting a player or killing them if they run off your screen. So you might say I don't have any experience being in a fleet or what it means to be in one. Well, the main thing is learning by doing. In this game, EVE Online is not a, there's no in-depth guide as to how to be a professional at the game. Never has, never will. There's only guidance, teachings, and lessons. And the best lessons are through death in the game. Every ship you lose should be a moment of learning experience. What you did wrong, how could you improve, what could you do better, or your friends, and how they die, and then you could learn from their mistakes and take it in for your own ways of improving. Another person might say, I don't have enough skill points to do much. Nonsense. If you're in a frigate, you're more than capable of helping out any fleet or in any PvP situation. There's been many instances in EVE Online where a day 1 character can defeat a day 30 or 3-year-old character. Skill plans will help you get on track, so the best thing is to specialize. So of course, when you're in a frigate and you're just starting out, within your first 30 days, you're just trying to figure out if you like the game, don't like it, what you might like. But once you find that role, whether it's primary DPS on fleet or tackling or electronic warfare, or maybe just providing boosts on the field, or maybe the equivalent of a healer, which is Logi. And once you find your place in the game, specialize in it, focus on it, because skills take a very long time to fully develop in this game. So the more you specialize, the less time you spend wasting time on skills that are just unnecessary for what you're trying to accomplish. As a disclaimer, most games teach players that bigger is better, and that's not always the case in EVE Online, let alone EVE Echoes. Just because you're in a battle cruiser or battleship in this game doesn't mean that a frigate or a destroyer can't kick your teeth in. And then your 48 million or 1.5 billion ISK ship went down to a 300,000 ISK ship just because you were incapable of piloting it, or you just lack the experience in PvP situations to truly bring out the potential of that ship on the field. Most games teach you to work towards endgame as well. That's not the case with EVE. There's no endgame. Endgame is what you make. It's the activities and the story that you make for yourself. In reality, nullsec could be seen as an endgame because it's sovereignty warfare, but that's not always the case. Your endgame could be trying to be the best miner in all of New Eden. It could be trying to be the most competitive market salesman of products, of ships and modules on the market, and becoming a tycoon. Other people's endgames could be trying to be the most feared pirate in lowsec and nullsec. Don't worry, there's no end game truly in the game to where you've accomplished everything and that's it. So the question is, how do we run fleets in 6E? Well, we have, of course, three typical fleets that are run. Planned fleets, which are predetermined activities, which we do through our announcements in Discord typically, and allows pilots to plan ahead for participating in them. And because it's a forewarning of when we're doing these fleets, we could typically have larger fleets and have a bigger turnout for combat. In the moment fleets are, of course, spur in the moment, like, hey, you want to go ratting, you want to do a mission, or hey, let's go PvPing. Or maybe sometimes there's a call to arms or call to action. And some people need help, whether it's they're getting engaged or stations being bashed, and you want to partake in it. And then the last one, standing fleets. They function primarily as a defense force within controlled systems of your corporation or alliance or coalition. Or you typically hunt in systems close by to where you call home. The goal of these fleets is to always have them up, and if somebody doesn't have one up, start one. Be the one that takes that step to try to get people organized and get it figured out. And of course, you could always do it while you're waiting on other forms of content, whether it's ratting or mining or whatever the case may be. Now, a certain other type of fleet is sovereignty fleets, which coming this December 2020 is when sovereignty will take effect for nullsec space. These are special fleets organized by your leadership typically, not just our leadership, 6E's leadership. The primary purpose is to either obtain or hold sovereignty within a certain system or cluster of systems, which of course is just taking over territory in the name of your corporate alliance. This typically involves a large amount of players from both assaulting and defending side if sovereignty is already held by another corporation or alliance. So these fights can turn out to be in the thousands of players fighting to either defend or assault a location. Ships sometimes will be covered by what's called an SRP or ship replacement program depending on your corporation or alliance. I would get with them to see if they have such a program. Essentially what it is if you take a ship that is per doctrine or per spec that they requested that you be in for setup, then if you lose it and you provide the kill mail, then they will replace it free of charge, just the ship itself. And then that way you can get back into the fight and get right back to it. These engagements for sovereignty can sometimes become quite stressful, and they have had the tendency in EVE Online to take hours, if not days, of just continuous combat back and forth on both sides. So keep in mind, if this is the content you want to do, this isn't just a one day and done or within a certain amount of time frame and it's done. This could literally be hours into days upon weeks of a war of attrition amongst both sides. So there's various types of fleets. The main three basic fleets as an example would be shields and missiles, such as caracals, caracal trainers, cormorants, condors, because they're fast, they're shield tank, and they've got the range. Then there's armor, which could be omens, maulers, coercers, and the shields are more skirmish, hit and run tactics, while armor is more, we're here to hold a specific objective like defending a station or trying to take sovereignty or maybe holding a position for the rest of the fleet. And then there's what most people enjoy running, which is kitchen sink. If you ever see a fleet that says bring kitchen sink fit, it means bring whatever you feel most comfortable in bringing. And it's just going to be a mixture of shields, armors, missiles, railguns, lasers. And it's pretty much just for fun. So if you lose it, you lose it. If not, you had a lot of fun. Any other kind of fleet compositions is up to the FC, honestly, because they determine what doctrines or what specific style of fittings that they want their members in. So consult with your FC, JFCs, or your leadership in your corporation or alliance before running out on specific fleet operations. So there's a few different fleet roles or a few different roles that are regarding fleets. The most common ones within a fleet are, of course, DPS, because you can't kill anything without it. So you're going to be applying DPS on grid or on targets that are called out by the FC. Tackle, or the tacklers, whether it's a light tackle or a heavy tackle, which that has been changed in terms of this update today as well because of interdictors, keeps the enemy on grid and in place. There's also scouts, which are typically cloaked ships. So it's primarily covert ops ships because they have the potential of cloaking and then being able to get target lock fast. or they can move around while being cloaked within the system. And they could check for potential gate camps, or they could hunt targets or scout locations of interest, such as stations to engage or sovereignty areas for the Corporate Alliance. Logi, also known as logistics, which most people might be a little confused why it's called that in this game, but bear with me. Logi, as they're called, are the healers of the fleets. They repair damage during fights, whether it be shields or armors. And just keep in mind, if you're a new player, also known as a Newbro, you can fill any role above. You just got to figure out what you want to do. You could do any of it. You could do all of it. It's totally up to you. It's your game, and the main thing is to have fun and enjoy what you're doing in the fleet. And if you don't feel like doing DPS one day, you could be a scout the next. Leading back into the light tackle and heavy tackle. Light tackle are typically cheap disposable ships such as frigates, or basic interdictors such as the destroyer class, which you can start using at tier 6. And then there's the heavy tackle, which are usually larger ships, and you'll see that with the heavy interdictors or the cruiser class interdictors, which have a way larger effective health points or EHP pool, and they're going to be have a higher survivability while also providing that disruption module to where anything in its bubble can't leave, can't warp away. All fleet roles are as crucial as the next, so just because somebody goes DPS, it means nothing if the target can't be tackled to stay on grid to kill it. And a fleet's not anything if they don't have the support system of Logi to keep them up during the fight. They could have all the greatest DPS, but if they're dropping like flies, it means nothing. Or if their shot callers down, it means nothing. And scouts and intel are the most important thing in EVE. You have to know, where is the enemy fleet? How many do they have? Where are they sitting? How far off are they sitting? That way you can kind of plan ahead of time. It gives you early warning on enemy gate camps, especially now that interdictors are introduced, or if there's fleet standing by that engage you for any specific purpose. Now we're leading into fleet preparation. What do you need to do in order to get prepared for them? Let's get into it. Is it your first fleet? Then speak up. Tell the FC that it's your first time, or the JAFC, or whoever is running the fleet. Tell them it's your first time, so that way they can either educate you on specific roles or how they will run things specifically in their fleets. And that way you have a better understanding of what is expected out of the fleet and what the purpose of the fleet is. If something's not clear, make sure to speak up, ask, get an explanation. Because the more you understand, the better pilot you become, and the more crucial you are in battles. And don't be afraid to lose your ships. A lot of games, people have gear fear, like Escape from Tarkov, Albion Online, EVE's no different. But once you get over that gear fear, and I know like 10,000 S looks like a lot right now, eventually 100,000 S will look like a lot, and then 10 million S will look like a lot. It's all easy to get back. The main thing that you need to get out of these deaths is experience. What lesson did you learn? Where did you mess up? How can you improve that for the next fight? What were they running that outdid you? Was it their speed? Did they have better DPS? Were they running specific modules? All that matters. So improve. Never stop improving. So what should you fly? Well, always read the CTAs to see what ships are being requested, or read the announcements for any scheduled fleets, or ask if a specific doctrine or fitting or type of ship is required. And if your corporate alliance has doctrines, which are specific set configurations or setups of ships, then it'll be easier because you can just reference it or glance at it and see what you need, and then you can start stockpiling it for future fleet events. And again, if it's unclear, just ask. You don't know unless you ask. So as a new bro, or a new player, you can always join with a frigate, whether it be a Merlin, a Slasher, a Maulus, an Atron, a Crucifier, a Tormentor. If it's your first time and you're a little concerned on if you'll do well or about losing your ship, stay in cheap ships. Learn how the fleets work first. Once you get more comfortable, you can start moving up in ship class, ship expense, module expenses. And the golden rule of EVE, whether it's EVE Online or EVE Echoes, don't fly what you can't afford. Because the minute you undock, you give full permission to get PvP'd. So if you're flying a 1.5 billion ISK ship and you're afraid to lose it, you might as well get rid of it, sell it, make that money, and buy plenty of cheaper ships that you have no problem losing. Because a lot of times you having all those ships and losing them and still having a ton of them left will make you a better pilot through experience. So as an example for fleet purposes, what to fly, Logi healers are always going to be more important than interdictors, which keep targets on grid, which will be more important than, for example, omens, which are damage dealers, which will always be more important than just any frigate. There's a certain chain of what's more desirable for fleets. Sometimes each FC is different. So again, just get with them. And if you can't bring anything else to the fleet, just bring a frigate. It'll be okay. I don't think they'll have a problem with either using you as a scout, because a lot of players start out as either scouts or tackle. Some players end up enjoying that the rest of their EVE career. But that you got to start somewhere. So start off in the cheapest, easiest role to fly in, a frigate. So how do you get ships? Well, there's different ways. Some corporations will do what's called a contract. When you click on your character in the top left, and then you go to the far right under assets and it says contract. Some of them will either send you one privately if you request it specifically through your Discord channel or your corporate alliances Discord channels or through in-game chat. And sometimes people just have public contracts, and sometimes they could be a good deal, especially if your corp is selling them publicly or to just specific individuals. And if you're one of the specific individuals, you can pick it up for a cheaper cost than what it would cost you sometimes to buy it on the market and buy all the modules. And just keep in mind, contracts are a free market, so anything can happen. If you want to see something specific, you could always consider seeding it yourself, which means just inject those doctrine ships into your local economy, either selling it on the market in a station that's there or through contracts. And of course, remember, there's no one shoe fits all. There's going to be different fits for different ships or for all the ships, and they're all for different situations. And most times actually, it'll always be cheaper to ship yourself, which means just getting it yourself. And it'll always even be cheaper if you make it yourself, but you got to spend the time to mine the materials. Or if you've got the ISK, it'll still come out cheaper to buy the materials and manufacture it yourself. So once you're in this contract screen, you'll be able to actually click in here and you'll see my contracts, and it'll show any contracts that are available for you that are undecided, which means that you haven't looked at them. So you can click on them, and if there's multiple items, it'll say view more items in contract or something of that sorts, and you'll be able to see the full listing of what's available in that contract for you. Now, in terms of, let's say, certain corporations or alliances have a ticketing system for either deliveries or manufacturing purposes, check with your corporation or alliance. Sometimes they do have a ticketing system, or they have individuals that are more specialized in those manufacturing needs or hauling needs, and get with them. They'll probably give you a way better price than what you're paying for on market if you deal with them directly. And for us, we have what we call the Spartan Fleet Supply Network. Just ask and we'll work with you on getting you what you need for the doctrines. Another way is, of course, go into the local market. Check your local market, whether it's Amar, Gehi, Jita, in Minmatar space, Task Mukran. Check the place. The market in this game will actually show you all markets across all of New Eden. It's not like EVE Online where it only shows specific regions that you're within. So make sure to click in there, see what's the best price for what you're trying to accomplish with it, with what you're trying to purchase, and check the distance. If it's too far, or if it seems like it's in a place that you just don't want to traverse because it could be dangerous, such as a null sec station, try to stay away from them. Don't get conned into, oh, it's the cheapest price in New Eden, but it's in nullsec. Let me go pick it up. And then the minute that you buy it and that player gets that notification, they undock with all of their buddies and kill you in that ship because they already made their money, and now you're going to lose that ship. And sometimes markets outside of the actual trade centers in the game can be a little bit overpriced. And on that same account, the trade markets can be extremely overpriced compared to other locations. But if you're a new player that's an alpha clone, you can't purchase outside the trade centers. So unfortunately, you have to deal with buying them at those trade centers, which also means you can't use contracts. Sorry, didn't make the game. That's just how they have it. But if you do get Omega, you can purchase at any market, any location, and conduct contracts between players, which means that you can optimize on getting the better price. And certain modules and hulls might not always be available. So again, if you've got a buddy that's manufacturing, or your corporate alliance, or maybe you, if you could strike up a deal, buy the blueprints or research them if they're cheaper, and if you have a high skill rating into them, and then just have them made, especially if they're not on the market, like the actual finished product, just have them made, stockpile them. Or again, consider seeding it yourself. And that's the best thing you could do. You don't see something there, it's a profit opportunity for you, along with providing something for others that might need it. And if you need something seeded in a market, at least within our alliance, we have a way of requesting items to be seeded in the local economy, especially if it's something that's heavily used by most players. So again, just ask. Don't be afraid to ask. Don't know until you ask or you make the request. And if you're looking to get ships, make sure to check your Corporate Alliance Discord. We have a ship ticketing system. So if you need something very specific made for and trying to get a good price, put in a ticket, see who responds, who's a ship manufacturer, and if the price hits you well, go for it. I mean, you're going to be flying it, especially if you're paying for it. So now we're in the back to the fleet stuff, aside from just fitting yourself and getting you shipped up. So now you're undocked. And now you have to stop your ships. Why? The FC takes stock of the fleet composition. Essentially, it's the FC is trying to see how many pilots do they have in fleet or among multiple fleets. What types of ships are they flying? What does he need more of versus the other? And he can inform pilots to make changes to setups or fittings based on requirements for the fleet. So how do you do it? Just hit the undock button in the station on the far right. Then, once you're out in space, hit the thruster icon to stop your engines. It'll be that icon that's pointed to. That'll be to the left of where your health and capacitor are. And there's different variations of locations for grouping the fleet. The FC might request that you do it on a gate, at a predetermined spot in space, on them, or in a specific system, or heck, outside of the station. If you don't hear them the first time, make sure to ask again just to confirm. It's better that you ask to confirm versus ending up in Timbuktu in the wrong place, or jumping into a system you didn't need to in the first place. XL&D, what is that? For those of you who have not played an MMORPG and don't have too much experience with EVE as well, they mean different things. They function as a ready check for FCs, or you pretty much signing up to join a fleet as a specific role. And this allows the FC to see how many pilots are running certain ships for the fleet too. It's more of a visual representation. And the FC may need volunteers for a specific role as well. So again, it helps the FC organize pilots and set up follow lists, which we'll get into that soon enough. So how do you do it? Well, in the bottom left, just click on the chat. Click on whatever is your corp or alliance, or some private channel that's been set up by your corp or alliance for communication, and just type in that letter in there, and that way they know what you're in and they can invite you. And just make sure not to talk in fleet chat during these times, as it can hinder the FC to get the fleet organized and set up accordingly, because they're having to jump back and forth between conversation, or they're trying to make sure there's nothing important that you're stating. So in most cases, X has been the general, the generic X up if you're in some, if you want to join, or it could mean X up if you're in a interceptor, for example, or L for Logi, or D for Dictors. And that way it just makes it easier to know, who's running what and who they can invite or need to invite, and that way they can balance out the fleet. Follow lists, as we mentioned previously, allow you to see the HP of any pilot that you click as a follow. Currently, the game only allows you to follow 5 pilots at a time. This is primarily beneficial for logistics or Logi ships, as they can see shield, armor, and hull. And it comes in handy for the fleet as well in some instances, or for an FC, because they can warp to these pilots, lock, etc., and whatnot. So if a scout is in system and they're on a position and they've tackled a target, then the FC all they have to do is click on that player in the follow list and boom, warp the entire fleet to them. If you're a Logi or if you're any player, almost always add the FC to your watch list, and whoever the FC designates as someone that you need to anchor on, which we'll get into that as well soon enough. But as a basic thing, anchoring is just following somebody. If you're a Logi, make sure you add your other Logi pilots, because that way you can keep them up in case they get targeted, and you guys can keep each other up, almost what's the equivalent of called spider webbing in EVE Online. And then as a Logi, you'll want to keep tackle and dictor pilots up as well. So how do fields links work? If you haven't heard the term yet, there's shield field modules and armor link modules. You'll see these typically on Guardian ships in the game, and essentially they're almost like command ships from EVE Online, but they're more of the lesser versions of them. They're like the beginner versions of command ships, and they have them as a destroyer and a cruiser class. Any Guardian or Guardian 2s will be able to run these modules specifically for giving AoE boosts or defensive bonuses to anyone within the circle for them. So shield field modules provide shield resistance increase when activated for pilots close enough to your AoE burst, and they consume fuel, meaning it consumes planetary materials for fuel, such as oxygen isotopes, suspended plasma, plasmoids. Armor link modules do about the same thing, but it's more, instead of increasing resistances, it actually takes a percentage of damage that pilots receive that are within your AoE, and it negates it to you, and it goes based off your resistance profile. So that means that a friendly pilot might have taken full force of, let's say, 300 damage, but instead they take roughly about 120 damage. So it looks almost nil to none of a difference in damage that they took. It looks like a fingernail of damage. Now Logi, of course, again, they're the healers of the fleets. They handle any remote repairing of members, and again, they're the healers for the entire party or the fleets. They're either typically a shield Logi or they're an armor Logi, and most will run that specific remote repair module for those specific fleets that they're in. Just remember, as important notes, put an L in chat when the FC asks for Logi to L up. Add all other Logi to your follow list so you can see their health and keep them alive. Add the FC and JFCs to your follow list, if primarily the FC if there's not enough space, but you should always have the FC on the list to make sure that they stay alive to be able to make calls. And make sure to join the fleet Logi voice channel in the fleet, or if your Discord's structured in such a way to where it's different wing divisions and stuff like that. And be sure to constantly check the broadcast history in case you miss someone for reps, and you can do that under the fleet command box that pops up when you join a fleet, and it's that little clock, and you'll be able to see if anyone made a request for repairs. Again, another note for Logi, make sure you pre-lock the FC. That means before, if you get into the system where it's going to get hot, make sure you already have the FC locked on, and then that way, or once you get on grid for the fight, make sure you have the FC locked. You spend less time trying to lock them to then keep them alive versus already having him locked on for the fights, and you can just start slapping them with some heals to keep him up. This keeps the FC alive, which of course is top priority for shot calling, but also the FCs are going to be the biggest targets to take out. This means one headshot, which is everything in the kitchen sink hitting them, in an attempt to try to take them off grid, so that way the rest of the fleet doesn't know what to do. Now we're moving into fleet operations, which will be more of the dynamics of what you'll be doing in a fleet when the FC makes specific calls or certain actions. So anchoring, as we had mentioned previously, is you're just following someone in fleet that's in charge of positioning the fleet during combat situations. The anchor flies the fleet during the engagements, with the remainder of said fleet always approaching them. So when you click on that player in your overview, or if you see his bubble in the top next to the overview, you can just click on the image or the name, and then you just hit the approach button. A fleet anchors, or who they anchors depending on the FC. So typically you'll see FCs be the anchor, but that makes them an easy target. So if the FC is willing, or if they trust someone enough to be the anchor, they can always designate somebody else as the anchor. So that way if they get popped, the FC is still alive and they can still make calls for the rest of the fleet during fights. So you could either, if the FC might call for you to approach them or orbit and keep at a certain range, or whatever the case may be. It's the FC's call, and every FC is different. So for example, there might be a Logi anchor or a DPS anchor. If you approach, so now we're into approaching. If you approach something in Eve Echoes, your ship will accelerate towards that object, but not enter warp. Due to warp only activating when you are above 75% of your max speed, approaching gets a fleet into warp faster. So examples where approaching is useful would be when the fleet FC or JFC or whoever asks a line towards XYZ location, or they make a ping to a line towards something, so everyone jumps as close to each other as possible. Then, or you could be burning out of a warp bubble together as a fleet if you get caught in one when you jump over a gate. And another thing is to stay on field, but have an instant warp out opportunity when you get low enough in health. So if you're doing ratting, or if you're in a fleet fight and you're red boxed and you're getting targeted, you can start approaching to a celestial object or a location, and then once you get into close to the hull, you can just warp right out because you're already at max velocity speed. Now, leading into tackling, for those who are frigate pilots or interdiction pilots, tackles, again, it prevents people from warping out by using modules such as warp disruptors and, as of today, warp scramblers and interdiction spheres for interdictors. So that has been introduced actually as of today. So how do you do it? Well, you have to overcome the target's warp core strength, because each one of these disruptors has a warp jam strength, which once you pretty much negate their warp core strength, or you get over that number towards a negative, then they cannot warp away, they cannot get off grid, and they either have to call for help or they should have fitted their ship a little bit better to not get tackled. And vice versa could happen to you as well, so do keep that in mind. That's where warp stabilizers or warp stabs come in handy in making sure that you have the ability to survive if you're by yourself in terms of ratting or mining. Going into the warping 2, things you can do is warp to fleet members. You can warp to stargates. You can warp to celestials, planets, stations, cargo containers, and you can choose a range between 0 and 100 kilometers. So all you got to do is just click on the location if it's in your overview, or on your main screen where you can click on it. And then when you go to click warp, make sure you press and hold it, and then you can actually drag it out to a specific distance of your choosing to either warp on 0 or warp at 30 or warp at 100 onto that grid, or to specific locations. Now going back to yellow boxing, red boxing. Yellow boxing is these are just terms for when you're in combat or whether you're ratting or fighting a player. Yellow boxing is when a target or an enemy has you targeted or locked onto, but they're not firing at you. They're not openly aggressing you. Red boxing means they have you locked, targeted, and they are opening fire on you, or they are attempting to land shots on you, or they have drones engaging you. So just keep that in mind. If you end up getting yellow boxed in a fleet fight, make sure to mention it. That way Logi can have you locked up in the event that you are either primary or secondary. If you're yellow boxed and somebody else is red boxed, that means that red boxed player is the primary and you're going to be the secondary after they get done trying to kill them. And now, for those pilots who aren't Logi, how do you broadcast for reps? Well, in the far left part of your screen, where you see your fleet amount of players in screen or in the fleet, or you see their HP in the follow list, just below that you'll see a command option. When you click that command option, it'll give you a few different options of what you can select to see for the fleet to see in the broadcast history. So you would click on the repair required, but make sure you don't spam it. Logi will understand the first time, and if after a couple of seconds or so, if they haven't locked you up, then ping it again after, I would say, 20 seconds if you're not getting aggressively assaulted. Or if you are, just make sure to point it out excruciatingly loud. And, you know, if you are yellow boxed, just make sure to pre-broadcast it. Because if they can get to you ahead of time of locking you up before you start becoming the primary, then they can get you healed up a lot easier and faster in the fight versus them trying to lock you up after you're red boxed. So now, what do you shoot if you're primary DPS or somebody else in the fleet that's not Logi or the FC or a scout? Well, you're going to shoot or target whatever the FC calls for over Discord or TeamSpeak or whatever you guys use. And if you missed what they were calling out and they broadcasted it or had somebody else broadcast it for you, just go through the history window in case you missed it. They might have broadcasted it so that way you could just see it in there, click on them, and then boom, you're on target. Some FCs will never call out the full names though of pilots, and especially now that there's foreign players such as Chinese in the game, it's going to be harder. It's going to be very hard and difficult for a lot of pilots to be able to call out whatever the first three characters of the names are. But typically you'll hear the FCs call out the first three characters of their name along with the ship they're piloting. And always stay on target and never deviate unless the FC specifically calls for free fire or weapons free. So what are primary and secondary targets? When an FC calls primary on a target, it means that all your DPS needs to go to that target. It's important that you switch targets if you're on the wrong target for DPS. The secondary target is the target you already lock up and move to after the primary target has been removed from grid or the FC calls the secondary target as primary. Why is it important, you might wonder? Often it's important that all DPS goes on the same target and switches at the same time. This puts more pressure on the enemy's Logi to keep the pilots up instead of applying spread damage. This also guarantees that your fleet eliminates as much hostile DPS from grid or hostile forces with force multipliers such as E-War, bursts, etc. off the grid as soon as possible. So when enemies die, you get a notification, also known as a kill mail in the EVE realm. When you get the final hit on an enemy, you will receive a kill mail notification in game. Post that kill mail in fleet chat so that other fleet members know what was killed. This can help the FC to know what was already destroyed off field, and it can also help with them determining what you lost if you're the one that died. So all you got to do is when you get that notification, click on it, it'll pop open another pop-up, and you'll be able to see the details as to what was killed, how much damage it took, modules, etc. So you died. What do you do now? Well, type in fleet chat what you lost. That way the FCs can see what they're losing in the fleet primarily, and they can adjust accordingly. Just don't say that you died in voice comms. No, it's nothing personal, but nobody cares. You cluttering voice comms saying I died doesn't matter unless you have important intel, such as in other games like shooters, like, oh, I died, he was in the top left building, third window. Then it matters. But what do you do after you die? Well, reship and get right back out there. Typically, if there's a station nearby, nearby the deployment area that you're at, your fleet's at, It's recommended to fly as an interceptor or a fast frigate to the location and have all your stockpile of ships there, so that way you could reship and get right back into the fight. Or you could always wait for the next fleet that may or may not deploy to the fight. That way you're not going alone. Warp bubbles are placed items in space and they become anchored. And prior to me having actually made this training, they weren't out in the game, but as of today, interdictor ships are a real thing, just like in EVE Online. EVE Echoes has them now with interdiction spheres. And what they'll do is that they'll prevent ships from pretty much warping away if you get stuck in them. Normal bubbles, there's two types of bubbles. There's normal bubbles, which I think is what we have right now, which they're placed, they're deployed by interdiction sphere launchers, either on gates or stations or planetaries or certain locations of interest, and they'll keep any target that gets hit, that pretty much touches it, from warping. And if you're in warp, it'll automatically stop you while as you're warping. It'll stop you dead in your tracks wherever you touch it. Drag bubbles are something from EVE Online, which we have to test and just be mindful of in EVE Echoes if this is the case. They are bubbles that are positioned behind the gate or location of interest. And what they do is if they're lined up to where you would be approaching that gate in such at the same angle, it'll actually pull you past the gate or past the location of interest and pull you straight to the bubble to where you cannot warp away. So be mindful of this if this is the case with today's update for EVE Echoes. So you've heard me mention grid or grids frequently throughout this. A grid is the space surrounding an object in space. So it's typically a sphere around you, which is up to 250 kilometers in any direction of your ship. So anything that's within that sphere is going to pop up in your overview. You'll be able to call it. It's on your grid. You can see it. Any object that's located outside of that is not visible typically in your overview and is considered off-grid. Off-grid, something off-grid for you might be on-grid for somebody else, and you could potentially warp to them if they're in fleet and they're at the correct amount of distance for you to warp to them. Insta Docking is where every station has a certain radius where you can immediately dock. You'll notice it with the lights that flash around the station, and when you're within that radius, it'll look like you're at 0 meters to the station or within 0 to 5 kilometers of it. So that means that you can, as soon as you undock or you approach the station and you're within that distance, you can immediately dock in the event of anything. So I mentioned headshots on FCs earlier. Headshots is when the entire fleet or enemy fleet targets that FC and they just so happen to know that that's your FC, or you've noticed that that's the player that they're anchoring on, and you pretty much throw everything at them in order to headshot that character. So a way to deal with headshots, which I mentioned earlier, is have another person act as the anchor for the fleet. So because they're generally perceived as the FC, and it's a good way to deceive the enemy. Remember, wars aren't fought valiantly and honorably at all in no spectrum of this game. It's through deception. So if you need to read up on that, get yourself a copy of The Art of War by Sun Tzu. FC pilots should be in the tankiest ship as well, because it'll help negate a lot of that potential damage that they would receive to insta-pop them. Again, I can't repeat this anymore. Logi, pre-lock that FC. Keep them up. If that FC goes down and there's no JFC, that fleet is going to be like chickens with their heads cut off. And having people who are willing to step up as the JFC or just step up in general in the event that the FC is headshotted is also beneficial for any fleet to stay viable on grid. In some instances, you will have to manually fly your ship. Manually flying is when you click in space to maneuver your ship during combat in certain directions and trajectories, and you're pretty much just, you have a little bit more control over your ship. And this does require some experience and some practice. but it can keep you alive in a lot of situations, whether it's a 1v1, gang, or fleet. This can be crucial to your survival, especially when you're webified, as an example, and you're trying to slingshot yourself further and further away from the target as they swing by you in order to give you that distance for your optimal range. And for those of you who are new players in the EVE universe, there's different modules that are called certain things, and these are the module slangs for them. If someone says scram, it's going to be short for warp scrambler, which keeps people from warping away, and they have a higher warp jamming strength versus warp disruptors, which are known as points. And points they're called that because they're long range and they don't necessarily have the strongest warp jam strength, but it's primarily just to get 1 point of tackle on them. Webs are, of course, webifiers, which slows the target ship. E-War stands for electronic warfare, which could be anything that interrupts the target's tracking speed, targeting range, their ability to pretty much do a lot of things, because every module is different for specific purposes. Damps, which are short for dampeners, which reduce the locking range or tracking speeds of enemy ships. Painters, which are target painters or paints as well, which increase the speed that friendly ships can lock onto that target, as well as increasing their signature radius to land shots more effectively. Newts, Nosses are energy neutralizers or energy Nosferatus, and those drain energy from the capacitor of your target. Now in EVE, there's a phrase called blue balls, which essentially is just not giving someone content. You're denying them that content and forcing them to be bored and lose interest and go somewhere else. So the reason for denying such content would be if the enemy brings a composition that you're unable to fight or win against, or if they have more ships than you, or they have bigger class of ships like battleships versus your destroyer fleet, or they outnumber you. So the best thing to do is just simply don't give them that content. Don't give them that fun. Let them see that you're not interested in making them feel better about themselves, and let them go somewhere else. You don't have to fight every fight. You just got to win the one. You got to fight the ones that you know you can win. This one's an old term, but it's still used today. Logovsky, which most Russians apparently some Russians came up with this term, and it's the technique of logging off in order to avoid combat or to set up a trap for unsuspecting prey. So for example, if you came across a mining fleet and they run from your gank, you set up a dictor pilot that logs off in that last location that they were at. The dictor pilot would immediately warp away to a safe spot, and it would DC them from the system. And then you take the rest of your fleet out, and then once the miners come back in, then you bring the dictor back in and you drop a warp bubble on top of them, and then they can't go anywhere. You bring the fleet back in, they warp to grid, they kill everything. Now, things to avoid. Avoid the fleet scattering to places. Make sure, like, warp to safe locations. Don't warp to the sun. That's a typical location that most PvPers who are knowledgeable will go to first. And another thing is deactivate all your modules, so that way you can get into warp and get out of the location. Or let's say you're getting ganked and you need to get out of the situation of being in a trap. Deactivate all your modules, drop fleet, close out the game, go in the top left, hit quit, which will be under your settings. You'll go to the top left, click your character, go to settings, and then click quit in the bottom right. And then once everyone's logged off, have your scouts or somebody who's scouting to come in the system, check to see if hostiles have gone away, wait for a bit, and then everyone needs to come back online. If this is like your ultimate final choice of option of things to do, is log off ski in order to survive. Now to go into couple of different things before we end it here. Prop mods. Prop mods are short for propulsion modules, and the term relates to afterburners or micro warp drives in game. FCs will sometimes call when prop mods need to be on or off to position the fleet or to burn out of a bubble, for example. So they'll say prop mods on or prop mods off, for example. And I mean, it's not rocket science. There's no complexity to it. It's just as simple as put them on, put them off if you've got them. Another thing, just especially from EVE Online, is instead of saying don't jump gate, which can lead to people accidentally jumping, the easier thing to say is the gate green or is the gate red? And that way it's easier and more audible. So if the FC says gate's green, gate's green, then everybody jumps. If they say gate's red, don't jump. Or maybe we're unable to jump. So jump and don't jump, again, can sound very similar and cause a lot of people, it still happens, to jump the gate because they misunderstood or misheard the FC. And this is why gate is green and gate is red will typically be used to avoid confusion and to keep people from accidentally being that one guy or gal that jumps the gate and then they're on the other side of a gate camp by themselves. So, closing thoughts for the training today. Again, this was a basic overview of how fleets operate, how to prepare for them, and again, ask questions. Ask. That's the best thing you could do. If you have any questions relating to the content today, reach out to me on Discord or in game, or drop it in a comment below. And if you want to find out when we run public fleets, check out our website, or again, message me on Discord and get with me, and I'll get you in the right fittings and when to get into them. And just remember, if you enjoyed the video, drop a like with a thumbs up, share it to social media, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy the content. Hit that notifications bell so that way you receive the updates when new content gets posted, or, you know, if I do any specific content postings or updates here on the channel or any other place. Well, again, I hope you guys learned something, and I hope you guys enjoyed the content. Catch you guys later. Love, peace, and chicken grease.